everybody. Welcome to the second day.
Morning.
No, it's morning. This is the second
day. The second day.
That's right. That's right. Well, I don't want to disappoint you. I was born in Baltimore, went to high school inside the D.C. Beltway. But here I am. What I'm going to talk about today is, first I'm going to give you an aggregate talk about the economics of automation, trade, and agglomeration, and then a disaggregated talk about that subject. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I think is the jumbled and incoherent public policy in response to the regional or the disaggregated problems that we have with this. So I think Moshe found me on account of a 2015 study called The Myth and Reality of Manufacturing. We followed that up with another study. It's got a lot of durability over the past couple of years. We actually wrote that to try to help policymakers in the Midwest stop chasing smokestacks. I didn't do it intentionally to make the Sanders and Trump campaign mad at me. That was just an added benefit. And we were asked to do a little introduction aspect here. I actually direct the Center for Business and Economic Research at Ball State, but I'm part of the Indiana Communities Institute. We're a research university. I'm a college of business without a doctoral program, and our goal with this Communities Institute is to match researchers from several disciplines with former policymakers or people who've been in the policy environment at the state and local level primarily, and then practitioners of economic development. And that helps us drive our research questions and think through the way we communicate them to policymakers. I think that's one of our enduring advantages to it. And so if I get the great benefit of working interdisciplinarity is it prevents you from saying stupid things outside your discipline. So if I say something stupid with regard to sociology, it's the sociologist's fault, not mine. So I'm going to start with a puzzle. And the puzzle here, what you see before you, is something called an impulse response function. And that is the effect of a 1 standard deviation shock to the cost of capital in the United Kingdom from 1850 to 2009 and the United States from 1950 to the most recent date of 2015 on the unemployment rate or disequilibrium measures of labor markets. And you can see that if the cost of capital rises, the unemployment rate rises as well. This suggests that in aggregate over these two very long time periods, capital and labor are complementary. That's a fairly iron law of economics, right? And the other graph is an effect of something called total factor productivity, which is the unexplained growth in productivity that can't be explained by adding people or capital to an equation. So it's really that many of you will hear this as the solar residual. It's the shock to capital. In this case, if you shock unexpected or unexplained productivity, if it gets higher, the unemployment rate drops. So this again suggests that capital and labor are complementary, or technology creates jobs in aggregate. But it doesn't explain this. And these are two pictures of Liverpool and Muncie. Muncie, I live on the left there. That's about 2 miles from Ball State campus. It's a 1.8 million square foot factory, closed in 2008. Borg Warner, if you're a race fan out there, that trophy that you get in the Indianapolis 500 is the Borg Warner trophy. Right, so what I really am going to talk about in the context of this is what's happening to places within the economy that are not experiencing the same benefits that these two graphs depict before. And let me go to one more, another equation. I want to thank Mark Muro from Brookings will be on later on today for the data on robotics. This is change in robotics and change in manufacturing employment growth from 2000 to 2015 in 382 metropolitan areas. Pretty strong correlation, right? And so the thing about robots is, what economists would say, I think what you heard this morning is that capital and labor complementary technology increases the demand for employment for a variety of reasons, but it doesn't necessarily happen in the same place with the same skills with the same people. And metropolitan statistical area, right? So DC, Muncie, and Indianapolis, and Cincinnati, elsewhere. Now the next graphic, and I want to say it's important to talk about both trade and automation and agglomeration together because most citizens and policymakers don't see them as different phenomena. And they may not be in the causal sense. Right, so what I have here is U.S. relative offshore ability risk. This is using data from Alan Blinder's 2009 study that measured occupation by risk of offshoring. And then we simply applied this to U.S. counties. And you can see here there are some counties with maybe a third of jobs at risk of offshoring, loss to trade. And there's a lot that goes into the dynamics of offshoring. It's not simply the possibility, it's also relative trade cost or relative cost of capital, transportation costs. But these are concentrated in urban places, in rural places, in small towns and big towns, but it's about 1 in 3 jobs. The next graph is the extrapolation of the Osborne and Fry data to the county level in the U.S. Now, there's problems with the Osborne and Fry data. I'll show you some pictures later on why I think it's substantially correct. And again, there's a lot that goes on in the decision to automate, but this is essentially the risk to automation. It's more like 60% in some counties, those red counties. And they don't overlap a lot except in a few places. In the industrialized Midwest, they tend to overlap a great deal, and that's sort of worrisome. And then a third graphic I have is from a forthcoming study of ours that depicts the changes in trade exposure between 2000 and 2010. A trade exposure, the risk that a job would go away because it could be substituted by imports is trade exposure. So the first graphic is risk of being offshored or lost to trade. The second graphic is the risk of a job being lost due to automation. And this is careful here. We don't automate jobs, we automate tasks within jobs. Right, so I want to be careful, but I'm talking to policymakers, so I've got to use single syllables and keep it real clear. And then there's this changing risk, a big spike in change risk, and this change again seems to be concentrated in metro areas, a lot of them in the Midwest. And so these graphics are neat. They depict the regional concentration of these. These are not sporadically, they're not uniformly distributed across the continent. They tend to be clustered together. We have measures of clustering. I'll show you the next one. These are the fancy word of spatial autocorrelation, but what it really means is the risk that I have of having either losing a high proportion of my jobs to either offshoring or automation is highly correlated with the average risk in the surrounding counties. So each one of those dots is a county and the average of the surrounding counties. And so you can see why the effect on labor markets broadly is very strong. If you lose a job and it's idiosyncratic, we heard about the 2 to 2.5 million jobs that die every month in the US, and another 2.4 to 2.7 million jobs that are birthed. Those are randomly distributed around the economy. If they're concentrated in the same labor market, they leave households with little good options nearby to either translate their existing skills or to skill up and find another job. And so the disaggregate effect of the disruption that we've talked about today is very concentrated in regions in the United States. And you don't have to be an economist to know that. So I live in a nice college town, right, that is about half manufacturing and half higher ed and med. And we went for President Obama in 2008 and President Trump in 2016, right? I mean, that's not my personal voting patterns, but that's what happened in our county, and so that ought to shock you. But if we look at, and the reason I would argue that the automation and trade component comes together is that and I'll talk about this down the road, is in people's minds you cannot tell the difference why the job left, right? And so we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about households, and this is again from the Fry and Osborne and the Blinder analysis. And so we have deciles along the horizontal axis here of exposure to either trade or automation. And we have 2 graphs of average wages of occupation, about 930 some occupations of an analysis here. And we see that the risk of trade losses is fairly uncorrelated to wages, right? So it's pretty much $36,000 a year on average if you're on the bottom quartile or the top quartile. But in Fry and Osborne's study, the top quartile of income has the lowest risk of automation. And so it's about $84,000 a job, drops to about $36,000 a job for the highest 10 decile risk. And I don't have a graphic on it. Why I think this is at least substantially correct for what we've observed recently is since we've been publishing ACS data, American Community Survey data on occupation and or earnings, employment by education level annually, the U.S. has created about 25 million jobs for people with a bachelor's degree or higher, about 1.5 million jobs for people who have either an associate's degree or been to college. That's the same statistical metric, and about a negative 3.5 million jobs for people who are only high school graduates. And so insofar as this data reflects what we've observed, it's fairly, I think, fairly robust to those concerns. I'm not sure about the timing. That's, if I knew that, I could make a lot of money, right? So let me talk about policies, because that's what I'm charged to do here, you know, on trade, people, and places, because that's what we face. This isn't a period of new policy innovation. We have existing policies that address these problems. And so we don't really know what the problem is, I think, as well as we think we should, and I think this conference depicts the truth of that. We've talked mostly about labor markets and about how much people care about jobs, but there's more to it. Trade and technology policy is alive and well. I got a call today by the Washington Post about trade policy and the new tax bill. And then we have people-based, place-based, and people-place-based, or place-based people policies. Let me talk about each. So we've talked today about the source of pain of this disruption of automation is in labor markets, but what if it's not? What if it's elsewhere? What if they're more than just labor market effects? We've heard, of course, labor market effects and household dynamics, and my sociologists tell me that the persistence in the literature about the effects in children is more than a generation or two. We know from running those shock models in the US that the worst performing counties due to manufacturing job loss in the 70s, the worst 25, none of them have recovered yet. So we're not talking about a decade or 5 years or short-term unemployment. We're talking about very lengthy periods of disruption. And so if I just look at the job losses in manufacturing between 2000 and 2010, about 5.5 million jobs. This is the China shock time period, right? And you look at the effect in the non-urban household, non-urban regions of the U.S., that's about the effect on home values of that alone was about $500 billion. Spread out across maybe 250, maybe 500 counties out of 3,144 counties in the United States. And let me just show you one county's depiction of this. This is where I live. And there are three graphics here. The red one is new home construction that stopped in about 2000, 2002. The gray line is the cost of a home. This is, I'm trying to calibrate this. For a lengthy period, you were making very little money building a home in this community. And then the blue line is the price. So if you bought a house, I bought a house in 2007, lucky me, great time to buy a home anywhere in the country. If you bought a home there in 1997, you're underwater now, still today. Now, we may have macroeconomic policies that could fix this. A little bit of inflation would be welcome, but if this is playing its way out in 500 American counties, right, 100 metropolitan statistical areas, fixing labor markets is not going to move people, right? They're not going to relocate. There's no capacity for households that have seen that destruction of wealth to simply move to a new place. So the problem is bigger than just labor markets. I'm skeptical on trade. So there are several good studies that emerged over the past couple of years. Darren Asamoglu, Otto Hansen and Dorn, Otto Dorn and Hansen, Otto and Dorn, and Pearson Schott. And sort of the 5.5 million jobs lost in manufacturing during the decade of about 2000 to 2010, the timing's not good because of the business cycle, about anywhere from 10 to 20% of those are probably pure trade losses. Those jobs went away because the products that were made there would never be competitive with foreign producers. And about 40 to 30% were trade-induced automation job losses. So given the opportunity to discontinue doing business with a customer, a business would have retooled or re-automated and shaved down their costs, created a new product line that could compete. And so it mathematically was an automation-related job loss, but it was stimulated by trade. So it's the same sort of effect. And on top of that, there's still an awful lot of relocation of commerce from rural places, small metropolitan areas to urban places. So all the metropolitan growth share hasn't changed, but there's been no growth in cities under 1 million people for about 20 years. And so if I'm living in a small town that manufactures someplace, does it matter if the job's automated, if it's moved to Indianapolis, or if it's trade-related job loss, which is exactly what happened in the big carrier deal outside of Indianapolis. They were going to close 2 plants. They got into the political economy fight. They saved one of the plants. The plant they saved was in Indianapolis. They automated it. They kept a lot of jobs. Very few of the people that worked there before will continue to work there. The new folks are going to mostly all have bachelor's degrees. And they closed a plant in Huntington, Indiana, a city of, or a county of like 30,000 people. So trade policy, we can reshore manufacturing. And by the way, this quarter looks to be the peak manufacturing quarter in U.S. history. We'll probably make more manufactured goods in this 3-month period than any time in history. This is the peak time. We're just going to do with a lot fewer people. Traditional people-based policies, we've heard about this together. The best thing that we know about this comes from Otterndorn and Hansen in 2013 in their China shock. And they exposed these places to 1,000, their estimates to $1,000 of trade from China. And they found that there was about a $67 spike for each one of these trade exposures in public finances. And about 7% of them are in the traditional short-term effects of unemployment insurance and trade adjustment assistance, right? So the other 93% of public expenditures was in Medicaid, long-term disability. Folks, that's the labor force participation rate graphics that we saw earlier today. They're being eaten up in disability. And how does this work? I'm a disabled veteran. If I lost I'm a tenure professor, if I could possibly lose my job today, I could certainly squeeze out more disability on that, particularly if I couldn't sell my home, right? But I'm not going to do that because I've got the job. If I lose the job, that's an opportunity that exists for almost every adult male, particularly working in skilled trades, or somebody's been doing backbreaking work in a factory for a long time. And then our graphic there on the right is the change in earned income tax credit due to trade exposure in U.S. counties. Very small. That's sort of one of the policies that we thought that you heard Andrew talk about earlier that would be a great deal. Gosh, I'm not sure if we're having about a 5% increase in earned income tax credit that's going to be sufficient. So I think I'm worried that we don't have in traditional people-based policies a way to move people productively from a place they're unproductive to productive, or move them into retirement that they care about. And there's a variety of reasons for this, right? What about place-based policy? So most of my research over the past 17 years has been in traditional local economic development analysis. These policies have largely been pretty bad. We probably spend $200, $300, $400 billion a year trying to relocate trade in the United States. For a long time, the Economic Development Administration actually paid communities to rob jobs from one another, right? Wow. Regional-based federal and state policies, things like empowerment zones, the enterprise zones, have had the kind ways to say this, very heterogeneous effects, right? Some places kind of good, mostly kind of not. And so it's very difficult to imagine this. And then the very large place-based policies, the Tennessee Valley Authority, scale of intervention, it's not clear to me that if we were to replicate that today, that we could even generate, we could move against the forces of movement to urban places or agglomeration. We were able to spread population out in the American South in the 1930s. Not clear we could do that today. So I'm skeptical of it. And just to show you how I think difficult local policies around moving trade is, this is a graphic of U.S. job creation. We've been a great machine for jobs since the late 1960s, right? We've created about 90 million new jobs over that time period. There's two types of jobs, footloose and non-footloose. Footloose jobs have to be attenuated either to a particular piece of land like agriculture or mining or population. And then there's footloose jobs that can go anywhere. So non-footloose jobs are this agglomeration effect mostly around people, because we certainly haven't created mining jobs or ag jobs in 50 years, right? And so those jobs are almost exclusively ignored by state and local public policy. They're chasing those footloose jobs at the bottom. There's three types. There's manufacturing. There's some small set of business services and financial services. If you peel off the financial services, right, because look, Fort Wayne's not going to get a big group of financial services moving there. That's a negative number. So we've been spending, in Indiana, which is relatively scarce at it, $1 billion a year chasing that horizontal line for 40 or 50 years. Michigan's been really working hard at $2.5 billion a year for 30 or 40 years. So I don't think we're thinking about this very effectively. Place-based people policies, right? So there are a few place-based people policies that show some effort. Raj Chetty has done a movement to opportunity study that to me is enticing but not clearly scalable. I mean, I have a couple of studies that show that even modest investments in transportation networks, bus, rapid transit in smaller Midwestern cities could generate significant welfare effects, but they're not scalable to a town that's lost 30% of its jobs in over a 2-year period, right? I think the heterogeneity of experience with some of the federal programs may be based on the capacity of local governments to adapt. So local capacity, regional capacity in terms of just the, counting for money, being able to hire engineering services and those sorts of things is a lot scarcer in places than you suppose. Indiana's tried a couple of these, a regional cities initiative that ironically Mike Pence came up with in the first year of his governorship, invested in 3 cities. Looks like a federal infrastructure bill, right? But for a lot bigger leverage, but it was focused on communities getting good at their capacity. Do they have regional works councils? Do they have regional plans where they prioritize regional activities? So it merited these places that had capacity. It left behind places that didn't have capacity to think beyond a local labor market or local municipal boundaries. And even if this happened, if we spent some time, which, and this is, by the way, is where the USEDA and the USDA are working, the Rural Research Institute, Rural Research Policy Institute that we house in our Indiana Communities Institutes, working on local capacity. Not at all clear to me that that's going to stop the regional inequality. It'll just save more places, right? We're still staring ghost towns in the face. So in summary here, I think the causal arrow is really clear. Trade automation and agglomerations are generating very significantly different regional outcomes. And I'm an economist, I think the literature is very clear that these factors together are generating some of the differences in outcomes that we saw in earlier graphs. I think they're visible when you drive around and see empty factories or see what's offered in stores or what is available for education funding. They're far more persistent than economists thought even a decade ago, and that's really David Autor has given, and his work has really led the way, Nobel-like, in understanding that, right? People and place-based policies aren't fixing this. It's not even clear that they're not making things worse, because rich places can offer greater incentives than poorer places. And the persistence of the effects are generational, right? So last year so I live in a college town, reminds me a lot of the neighborhood. I grew up in Great Falls in the 1970s, right? The local hospital that's 1.5 miles away from me had over 500 opioid-related overdoses appear at the emergency room last year, right? So that, I'm not going to draw the causal arrow to unemployment and opioid use. That's somebody else's task, but it's visibly shaking American communities. Thank you for the opportunity, Moshe. I have a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, so this is depressing, right? I appreciate the honesty. You've noted a bunch of things that don't work. What would, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that infrastructure spending could do in the short, so this is always a short run equilibrium problem, right? We're going to create new jobs. We really suck at trying to figure out what demand is going to be generated by technology. Nobody living in Yorkshire, Northern Britain in 1813 ever supposed that people would need 2 suits of clothes at any one time, right? So we don't know what else will be generated out there. I think our school system is not training children at all with the capacity to relearn. And when I see young men moving into labor force, you know, in my community, many of them are just lost. The skills that they think they have aren't at all suitable. And I suppose that policies that would give people something like uniform basic income, that give people the opportunity to spread out their education over a longer period of time and to sustain interruptions into earnings would be something suitable. But we're not even close to having that conversation yet in a way that I think is going to get us to a place where we say this is fiscally possible. Who are the people that would still be left out if we did this? So, you know, I have a nephew, smart guy, 23, can't get his welding degree, just flouting through life, and I think that's probably happening to 40% of young men.
Hi, I'm Maggie Oates. I'm at Carnegie Mellon University. I also grew up in West Lafayette, a couple hours west of you. And I want to, not an economist at all, preface that. I want to tie your talk to a previous one that we heard today. I see your first bullet point, trade automation and agglomeration generate regional differences. So I want to tie that to, excuse me for forgetting his name. Yeah, Longman's talk about deregulation. I was wondering if you would comment on that, given your background.
So my work on antitrust has been separated by 15 years, 20 years of grad school. It's very difficult to see how that, I'm not disputing that we need better antitrust. It's difficult to see an empirical connection between antitrust or the size of businesses and the deep hollowing out. I mean, it could be a contributing factor. I mean, I'm very intrigued by Charles Murray's work on the Fishtown Belmont, because I live in Belmont with Fishtown 2 miles away. And I think that there are multiple causation here, but you cannot explain 40% divergence in per capita income, or in the city that I live in, 7% decline in per capita GDP over 15 years to antitrust.
So traditionally, young people have moved away. They go to a place where there's more opportunity. This doesn't seem to be happening. Is that because young people don't have the skills to get a job in another more flourishing community? Or
Yeah, great question. So the brain drain has been a persistent problem in the Midwest. Many of these places have been losing population 30, 40, 50 years. One of the things we know from migration, this is a really unpleasant thing, is that it tends to capture the top half of human capital. So imagine a model in 1950 where human capital will equally distribute in a bunch of hexagons in a flat space, and then randomly shock them, and every time the shock's negative, you pull out the top half and go to a place where the shock's positive, right? And then it's self-reinforcing. You get big cities, and you get declining places with less and less human capital. I worked in West Virginia for 5 years, go to McDowell County. Interesting, because in 1950 had the highest density of millionaires now, 115,000 people. There's 15,000 people now, 3,000 jobs supporting those. I mean, it's a catastrophe. So I think partly is many of the households that are being shocked don't have the ready capacity to relocate. They don't have support systems. They don't see that future for them. And there's a whole milieu of this that's well beyond what an economist can observe or comment.